We're going to talk now, though, to Jonathan Davis, economist and presenter of Booms and Busts podcast, because he's always got an interesting view on the state of the economy of this country. He's always been saying that the furlough scheme is possibly one of the worst ideas anybody ever had. Jonathan, a very good morning to you. Welcome back.
Thank you, and to you too.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, it looks as though 612,000 UK workers have lost their jobs so far. The fear is, I suppose, that once the furlough kicks in and the furlough ends, I suppose is what I mean, that will become a much larger number by some considerable margin.
We're going to see, I'm afraid to say, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of companies just going bust. And they're already planning to make, I'm estimating, I'm afraid to say, 1.5 to 3 million unemployed. But there's no need for them to do that yet, because the government has got the most expensive unemployment scheme on the planet. It's called the furloughs, the self-employment scheme, and so on. The government's just pretending all is well. Well, nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, I suppose the problem for the government at the time when they did the lockdown was that if they hadn't committed to a furlough scheme, we would have gone straight to sort of economic ruin rather than go rather slower to it.
Well, of course, the first mistake was that we went to lockdown. There are many examples around the world where they didn't go to lockdown, and of course, they haven't had economic catastrophe. Clearly, you're right. There's a question of do you take a hit immediately, or do you have to take a hit inevitably, and the hit will be even bigger? Because remember, what they're doing is they're borrowing vast amounts of money from our futures to pretend that everything's okay now. Well, politicians don't understand the real world. Their job is to get elected and then re-elected. They're marketers, in other words. In the real world, we've got only so much money to play with. And if as a politician you borrow vast amounts of money, then what that eventually does is that negatively impacts sterling, our currency, which as it brings down the value of our currency, which therefore increases the cost of imports, and we are an importing country, which raises inflation, which raises the cost of living and the cost of doing business. It makes it even worse in the long term. Well, it's just silly.
Well, it may be, but I'm not quite sure what the alternative would have been, Jonathan, because at the time when the lockdown happened, and I know you will say that there will be other countries that have done better economically. There's not many, though, because the world economy has been shut down effectively. I mean, nobody's flying anywhere. There's no business being done by people who would normally do business with each other in different countries. There's trading kind of, dead zones going on. There's nobody buying cars. There's nobody taking flights. There's nobody booking hotel rooms. There's no tourism. It's not as if it's a simply isolated case here in the UK, is it?
No, not at all. But they did not need to close down our economy. Japan, South Korea, Sweden, Switzerland, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, even Ethiopia and other countries did not close down the economies, and they have not been particularly affected any more than we have by the virus, and indeed their economies have not been shot to pieces like ours and other countries who did lock down. The fact that they locked down, then it's one of these, it is what it is, we are where we are. What should they then have done? Well, what they shouldn't have done was paid people at the level that they're paying, that they started paying and they're still paying. They should be rapidly reducing this unemployment benefit, which they're calling another name, furlough, self-employment, and so on. They should be, instead of continuing to inflate prices, which is in effect what they're doing, they're inflating the cost of living. They're inflating the cost of doing business. Instead of doing that, which is what they did in the 1930s, and look what happened in the 1930s.
Yes, but I suppose
they should, however, they should be letting the economy get back to where the economy wants to go. And if that means a short, sharp shock, so be it. by inflating, what you do is you negatively impact for a generation.
Yes, but that's also has a reverse side to that coin, doesn't it, Jonathan? Because frankly, looking at the queues yesterday, looking outside the various shops that opened for the first time since March, there's plenty of people out there with plenty of money to spend. Now, they will spend that money. It will go into the economy, as indeed has the money that's been spent in supermarkets been going into the economy. And all we really perhaps need is for more parts of the economy to open up so that these people who have money, because they have been furloughed, are willing to spend it. And that surely would be the way out of this, wouldn't it?
Well, there's no question that with the massive crash in the economy in the first half of the year, approximately astonishingly 25% of the economy just stopped. There will be, and there is already, a massive surge in the economy as lockdown is ending, and that was always inevitable. Yes, there are people with money. There's always going to be people with money. There's always going to be businesses with money that can buy other businesses, for example. And the surge in the economy post-lockdown will be material. But 2020 will still see the size of the economy approximately 10% smaller than 2019. That is a huge recession, a multiple the size of 2008. And following the resurgence, the economic growth will be lackluster, if at all, for years because of this increasing inflation that we're going to see in our economy, significantly higher costs of living, significantly higher costs of doing business directly as a result of government policies.
Well, is it the case as well, though, Jonathan, that those who agree with you, Peter Hitchens being one of them, who I speak to on a regular basis here on this show, you don't ever really have an alternative that could have been done back in the day when when the lockdown came in? What would you have done to make it different?
I wouldn't have paid people to sit around doing nothing at the rate at which they were being paid. People should, if businesses weren't doing business, they should just have made people redundant. If businesses weren't doing business, they should just have been going bust. In an economy which is massively over indebted already, the solution is not to increase the debt further. That's unfortunately what we've been doing for 25 years. And you keep going back to the short term, and I can't disagree with you on that. There's no question that the stimulus that they've done has kept the economy short term on a relatively even keel. Of course, that's the case. But what it does, it creates a massively bigger problem because all they're doing is kicking the can down the road. And that can is not going to be in 10 years' time. It's going to be in 2 years' time when we see the inflation coming into the system and the economic growth post the surge that we're seeing just now, post-lockdown, will not continue. We will see materially higher unemployment, 2 or 3 million extra unemployed for many, many years. Whereas if we'd had a short, sharp shock to the system, it would have been difficult. Indeed, it would have been just as catastrophic as it's going to be, but it would have been shorter term. This way, we create long-term endemic problems which will not be solved by increasing the debt and increasing the inflation. It will sustain the economic problem. We've put millions of people and generations on the scrap heap for short-term reasons.
Well, I disagree with you entirely, Jonathan, but we've got to end it there. We'll have to get you back on and have a proper row about it. But thank you very much indeed. Jonathan Davis, economist, presenter of Boom and Bust podcast. Very sensible man, but I disagree with him because you can disagree with people without falling out with them. You can disagree with people even if they're sensible, because he has a particular view. I think it would have been a total and utter disaster for this government to allow people to have been made mass redundant if they'd shut down the economy and not provided some form of cushion for them, because that would have been hopelessly bad. It would have been hopelessly short-termist, and it would have been also hopelessly kind of, short-sighted, because in the end, nobody knew how long this would take. Nobody knew when we would get to the point where I believe we are now currently at, which is basically that the economy is beginning to recover. The economy is beginning to come out of what the lockdown was, and the economy will stimulate itself. Now, you could also argue that the government will also be doing its part, because the government will not allow the economy to fall through the floor. And contrary to what Jonathan said, there are no countries in the world that have come out of this looking brilliant. Nobody has. So let's not completely continue to compare and contrast. Sweden, which has been mentioned in the past, yes, kept their economy going to some extent while still suffering more or less the same amount of damage to the population in terms of the disease. But actually, their economy is not doing particularly well, because people haven't been spending the same kind of money, despite the fact that they could go to a restaurant, despite the fact that they could go to a bar. That hasn't really helped the economy of the country, I'm afraid. We shall see. But we don't know the full and frank answer to all of it yet. But keep listening to this show and you'll find out what that's going to be.